Hi, this is lesson number 32, and today we'll talk about pharmaceutical production. I will focus primarily on small molecule manufacturing. In this topic, you will be introduced to the various definitions around production and processing, as well as packaging, etc. Production mapping, we'll just follow an example of a production steps in a small molecule facility. The requirements around handling and control of materials used in the production process, as well as controlling the production process itself. Cross-contamination will be discussed and how to prevent it. Batch numbering systems, finished goods and documentations associated with production, and finally, conclusion. All operations involved in the preparation of a pharmaceutical product, from receipt of materials through processing, packaging, labeling, to completion of the finished product, is considered to be the definition for production. Processing then is any part of production cycle, starting from weighing of raw material right through to obtaining your final bulk product or your API. Packaging is that part of the production cycle, starting from bulk product to obtaining your finished product, and starting materials consist of raw materials and packaging materials used in the production of the product. A typical production map is detailed in this slide, and production operators must follow clearly defined procedures in accordance with approved specifications, with the objective of obtaining products of desired quality. And normally the process flow looks like something like this: raw material preparation or weighing out, as well as labeling and receipt of the material in the warehouse, weighing of that material in a dedicated area on dedicated balances, processing the material in the production site, bulk storage. So during the process, sometimes the API or the product is stored in bulk containers until a passing result is obtained from an in-process sample, for example. When the in-process passing result is obtained, the process continues on to the filling and packaging areas, and finally the product is delivered to the warehouse, where it's quarantined until the final QC testing is done on the product, and it's released off-site. The basic goal is to produce finished products from a combination of starting materials, to look after all the materials which will influence the quality of finished product in an efficient manner, where everything is labeled correctly and accurately once it's received, compliance with GMP guidelines to avoid product being rejected or recalled from the market. Some basic material requirements are handling procedures around packaging materials, raw materials, or starting materials. All incoming materials should be quarantined immediately after receipt until they are released for use in production. They need to be stored under appropriate conditions, whether that be temperature or humidity, and these conditions need to be monitored and recorded routinely. Storage conditions should be in an orderly fashion to avoid mix-up and cross-contamination. Ensure that there is an effective system for controlling the stock, so ensure that consumption of starting material follows first in, first out, or what we call FIFO, or EEFO, which is earliest expiry first out system. Raw materials should be purchased from qualified suppliers. Personnel in charge of raw material purchase should have sufficient knowledge of the materials, products, and suppliers of this material. So it's not uncommon for process chemists to get involved in the raw material purchasing procedures. Raw materials should be purchased from qualified suppliers. Raw materials should have approved specifications, and deliveries are accompanied with a certificate of analysis. And it's suggested to purchase raw materials directly from manufacturers or appointed distributors. So again, it's not uncommon for the pharmaceutical site to audit their raw material suppliers to make sure they're compliant with regulatory guidance documents. Incoming materials should be clearly marked, whether they be in quarantine, whether they have been sampled or released following QC testing, or rejected and put on hold. Rejected material should be clearly labelled and marked as such, and should be stored separately in off-limit area where access is controlled only by specific individuals. The actions taken then should be the rejected material should be returned to the supplier or reprocessed. The actions should be described and defined in a procedure, standard operating procedure. The actions that are to be taken should be pre-approved by authorized personnel and written up in a record, namely a deviation record or a change control record. So some basic processing or production guidelines and verified for their conformity to specifications and be traceable to the product. Samples of raw materials should be physically checked for conformity to specifications prior to release for use, and they should be clearly labelled. All materials received should be clean and checked for appropriate protection packaging to ensure no leakage or perforation or exposure to the environment. Deliveries of raw materials that do not conform with specification should be segregated and quarantined appropriately as per standard operating procedures. All your equipment should be sufficiently cleaned as per standard operating procedure. Operation on different products should not be carried out simultaneously in the same room unless there is no potential risk of mix-up and contamination. All materials should bear clear labels and batch numbers, and limited access in production area where only authorized personnel are actually allowed into the production area. Handling of materials and products should be based on written instructions and procedures, and where necessary recorded. All work instructions procedures should be written and approved. Batch manufacturing records, or BMRs, should be well recorded by qualified and responsible personnel or the operators during production. There are several guidelines that should be followed prior, during and after each production activity, and these are area clearance or line clearance should be done to avoid mix-up of starting materials or finished products. In-process and environmental controls should be carried out and recorded routinely. Indication of failure of equipment or services should be monitored, and only equipment in good condition should be available in the production area. Cleaning procedures should be written and approved. Containers should be cleaned prior to use. Any deviations from requirements and expected results should be recorded and investigated prior to the start of production and prior to release of your finished product. Pipes used for conveying water for pharmaceutical use should be sterilized according to SOP. Checks should be carried out to ensure that the conveying water for pharmaceutical use should be sanitized according to written procedures. Weighings, measurings and recordings and control equipment should be serviced and calibrated at pre-specified intervals and records maintained. And finally, repair and maintenance operations should be recorded at all times. So reconciliation, if deviations occur, they should be approved in writing by a designated person with the involvement of Quality Control Department or Quality Assurance Department. Check on yields and reconciliation of quantity should be carried out as necessary to ensure that there are no discrepancies outside acceptable limits. Points to be considered in the reconciliation of a batch is the quantity of the starting materials, output of finished products, machine efficiencies. All activities concerning reconciliation should be conducted based on written standard operating procedures. Some interesting facts are then it takes 10 to 15 years to develop a medicine or a vaccine, and it costs on average 1.38 billion to develop a single medicine. So once your product is developed, it costs such a vast amount of money to ensure that your product remains safe and effective for its use for the final end user. So that's why we ensure that there's tight controls around production at all times. Cross-contamination. When dry materials and products are used in production, special precautions should be taken to prevent the generation of dust, and there needs to be appropriate air control, for example, supply and extraction of air of suitable quality. Contamination of a starting material or product by any other material or product has to be avoided at all times. Accidental cross-contamination can arise from uncontrolled release of dust, gases, vapors, or particles from materials and products in the process, from residues on equipment or operators' clothing or their skin. The most hazardous cross-contamination needs to be avoided by taking appropriate action. For example, carrying out production in dedicated and self-contained areas, conducting campaign production followed by appropriate cleaning in accordance with a validated cleaning procedure, providing appropriately designed airlocks or pressure differentials and air supply and extraction systems. The risk of cross-contamination needs to be minimized due to the potential risk of contamination caused by recirculation or re-entry of untreated or insufficiently treated air. You can do this by wearing protective clothing, by using cleaning and decontamination procedures of known effectiveness, using a closed system in production, testing for residues, and using cleanliness status labels on equipment. Measures to prevent cross-contamination and their effectiveness should be checked periodically according to standard operating procedures. So batch numbering systems, a product identification system or batch number should be assigned to every finished product, every bulk and semi-finished product, which enables the history of the product to be traced. A batch numbering system should be unique and specific for the product and non-repetitive for the same product. Creation of batch numbers should be based on written procedures or standard operation procedures. The batch number should be printed on both the primary packaging and the secondary packaging as appropriate. A batch number may give information on the date and year of production, the country or the manufacturer or subcontractor. Records of batch number should be kept and maintained for every finished product until at least 1 year after the expiry date for traceability factor. While awaiting approval, finished products should be placed and kept under quarantine at the finished product warehouse, and the quarantine label needs to indicate the date, the product name, batch number, quantity, as well as number of pallets of the finished product. All labels concerning with the status of finished products should be clearly shown on the containers. Quarantine status can be in the form of a computer system tracking, or they can be physical, for example, pallets or ropes or racks in a warehouse. Rejected products need to be identified and physically segregated and taken out of stock. Further processing needs to be identified, whether that be rework, reprocessing, or destruction. Some of the documentation then around that's required in the production of API material should consist of primarily the master formula, which should contain the name of the product and the part number, along with description of dosage form, strength and batch size, a list of the starting materials, expected yields with acceptable limits, processing location and principal equipment used, methods of preparing the equipment, detailed stepwise processing instructions, along with in-process controls and requirements for storage and labeling. So that's quite a large document, the master formula. The next one then is the batch manufacturing record, or the BMR, and that contains information like the batch number. So every batch will have its own BMR, the dates and times that the batch was manufactured, persons responsible for each stage of production, and the initials of the operators, along with the second person verifier, or the person who checked the operator's work, batch number and quantity of starting materials, along with raw materials, processing operations, step-by-step instructions, along with in-process controls. The yield will be documented at the end of the BMR, along with any deviations that occurred from the master formula. You also need to include packaging records, which will have details of the person responsible for the packaging operations, the initials of the operators, any checks that were used for the identity and conformity of the packaging operations, and also they include samples of the printed packaging materials, along with any deviations associated with the packaging operations, and obviously any details of quality control checks that were carried out throughout the manufacturing process, along with references to any deviations. So production operations must follow clearly defined procedures in accordance with approved specifications, with the objective of obtaining products of desired quality. Production steps should be effectively monitored and thoroughly documented to ensure safety, quality, and efficacy of the final product. Thanks for listening. That's the last slide.